Good afternoon. My name is Colette Watson, and this is Free Press Live, brought to you by Free Press, a nonprofit, nonpartisan media reform advocacy organization. Free Press Live is your weekly source for updates and live discussion of what's happening in the world of communications rights. Learn more about our work at freepress.net. Today, I'm excited to welcome you to a special episode of Free Press. Over the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, the most deadly act of mass violence against the Black community in the United States history. The anniversary of that event is May 31st and June 1st of this year. And joining us today to discuss how media played a role in sparking and suppressing the tragedy is special correspondent, my colleague, Joseph Torres. Joe Torres advocates in Washington to ensure that our nation's media policies serve the public interest and builds coalitions to broaden the movement's base. Joseph frequently writes on media and internet issues and is the co-author, along with Juan Gonzalez, of the New York Times best-selling book, News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media. He is the 2015 recipient of the Everett C. Parker Award, which recognizes an individual whose work embodies the principles and values of the public interest. Before joining Free Press, Joe worked as deputy director of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Born and raised in New York City, Joseph is proudly Puerto Rican. Joe, as I know you at work, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm doing okay. Doing okay. How you doing? I mean, we got cicadas over here in DC all out. So, but I'm doing okay.
Yeah, no, that's quite a situation going there on the East Coast. We're doing well here out west. And I know that this week, though, even beyond that is probably a heavy moment in many ways for many of us. We are commemorating 1 year since the murder and subsequent viral video of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And then in just a few days here, we'll be coming upon the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. So I know that there's a lot that's happening. President Biden is welcoming George Floyd's family into the White House. There's a Justice in Policing Act that's being considered, hotly debated in Congress. And just a few days ago, some of the survivors of the Tulsa Massacre testified before Congress, over 100 years old and still fighting for that truth to be known and to be heard there in the halls of government. So I think there's just so much that's meaningful this week, and I'm holding deep appreciation for you, Joe, because you've done so much to unearth the history of how media played a role in the Tulsa Massacre. And you're always doing so much to unearth the history of media harm and our work on the Media 2070 project at Free Press. I'm constantly learning from you, and I'm really grateful to have you here on Free Press Live today.
Well, I appreciate being part of Media 2070 team that I get to actually do this work, and being part of this team, allows me on behalf of the team to dig into history and the reckoning that we still haven't. When George Floyd was publicly executed last year, there was a reckoning in the media system. There was a reckoning in our society, but also in the media system about its anti-Black racism, right, and its racism, and through so many tragedies in this country, especially anti-Black violence against the Black community. There's a role the media is normally often, I would say, play in each of these incidents, including the Tulsa massacre.
Absolutely. And I think oftentimes we think of media as sort of an independent, unbiased, objective arbiter and verifier of truth. But what we have come to visibilize and are working to visibilize with communities is that media is a system and functions as a system, much like the criminal legal system, education system, and others that we fight against day to day in terms of the oppression that they have represented for Black communities and other folks of color. So when we talk about the media system and we talk about the Tulsa Massacre, first of all, what happened in the Tulsa Massacre and why wasn't it well known about until recent years?
They've been working on a short paper that's going to come out likely tomorrow on the Tulsa Massacre, it's I know a little bit about the Tulsa Massacre in the broad strokes, but not in the details, right? And we actually work for a living in an area where we're actually studying media. The general public has little to no knowledge about what happened in Tulsa. And in 1921, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune published a front page story. The headline was something like "Nab Negro assaulting white girls in an elevator," something like that. And it was like a paragraph story that talked about that turned out to be a false accusation of a black teenage young man named Dick Rawlins, was 19, who supposedly tried to rape a 17-year-old white girl in an elevator, and it turned out not to be the case. But that set off in motion. The Tulsa Tribune was an afternoon paper, and the publisher, it's described by an author of a book on the Tulsa Massacre called the publisher, I believe, Richard Lloyd Jones, if I remember his name correctly, the most vocal racist in the city. And so he supposedly published an editorial to accompany this in the paper that was predicting a lynching that night. And many survivors seen that, folks who survived the massacre saw that editorial, since gone missing. It hasn't been found to this day. But that article itself, the two articles, including the front page story about the attempted rape, accusation of rape, resulted in white folks in the community by the thousands going to the courthouse and demanding that the police turn over Dick Rawlins because they wanted to publicly lynch. They wanted to lynch him. And Black Tulsans, many who were World War I veterans, took arms, went down to the courthouse on two different occasions to offer the police to help protect Dick Rawlins from a lynching, and the police twice declined their offer. On the second time, they went to the courthouse and offered their help in protecting Dick Rawlins. A white person in the mob tried to take a gun away from one of black folks from Greenwood, from the historical the black community in Tulsa, and there was a gun fired, like it was either discharged or a shot rang out, and that resulted in the beginning of the Tulsa Massacre. The white community, many of them hundreds of them were deputized by the police on the spot and given ammunition by the police, and they invaded the Tulsa community known as Greenwood, which is often referred as the Black Wall Street, and over the course of 18 hours, killed men, women, and children indiscriminately. It was the first time that airplanes was used used against his own citizens. There's reports that dynamite was believed maybe dynamite was used to drop on the citizens below and firing on the citizens below. And at the end of the day, over 300 people died in the massacre, the vast majority being Black, and thousands of Black folks were put in concentration camps as a result of being, in Greenwood was like 35 blocks, right? It was a thriving community, 35 blocks. It had hotels, it had two Black newspapers, it had doctors, pharmacists, lawyers. It had more than 1,200 homes were destroyed. It was a remarkable place, and again the newspapers, like sensational coverage of it, resulted in a mob going down to the courthouse, and this lit the spark basically that resulted in the massacre. And of course, as we see there, the city officials, the police and the National Guard rounded up, or they didn't even the local National Guard didn't help out. to try to disarm white folks, they started to detaining black folks as they and it's arresting everybody, and also took part in violence as well. The National Guard, it's been reported the National Guard also took part in the violence against the black community in Greenwood. So it was a massacre. It was a massacre, and that is going to be the 100th anniversary coming up next week of what happened.
And, we talk a lot about Juneteenth and Kwanzaa when we talk about Black community observances. But May 31st and June 1st of this year marks 100 years since that Tulsa Massacre in 1921. And I don't think it's as broadly known in the public consciousness rather, as some of those other commemorations. Right. For folks who maybe are just tuning in, my name's Colette Watson. I'm here with best-selling author and my colleague, Joseph Torres, discussing the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, in which hundreds were killed, thousands were displaced, dozens of businesses were destroyed, including 2 Black newspapers. But before we talk about the Black media, I want to talk about some of the 2 dailies that Tulsa had at that time, which were owned and white-owned and controlled, rather. Can you talk a little bit about those 2 papers and what role they played after the massacre? You mentioned the report, which we had up on screen there, where one of the papers called for the arrest of the Black teenager, Dick Rowland, which ended up sparking, the violent confrontation there and led to the white citizens destroying that business district. But what really happened after this massacre in terms of the coverage by the local white-controlled media, and how did that play into this event not being as widely known about through history?
So we always, obviously anti-Black violence in the news, in media, we always talk about it also in terms of the narrative, the anti-Black narratives that are told.
Right.
But also the violence also comes from not telling the story as well, like not what story is being told and what story is not being told. And we have both that in Tulsa. We have both that all the time, right? And so in Tulsa, the Tulsa World, which still in existence, is a daily newspaper, and the Tulsa Tribune. The Tulsa World was the morning paper. The Tulsa Tribune was the afternoon paper. Afterwards, prior to the massacre, they according to the Race Riot Commission and other writings, the Black community was largely ignored in the daily life of Black folks in the Greenwood community was largely ignored, except for coverage of crime, which is not, of course, surprising, right? That still happens, right? All the time. Afterwards, they started to editorialize. They started a part of the effort in the city, from the mayor to the police chief and all that, to blame the Black community for the massacre. Because Black folks took up guns to try to protect Dick Rowland, they blamed the Black community for agitating the massacre, and they racistly refer to Greenwood as Little Africa. One of the editorials, Tulsa Tribune, called it End Town, right? And that it needs to be not, it needs to not to be rebuilt. And I believe the Tulsa World talked about like silk. We can't have silk shirted Negroes, who are criminals and all that. The city needs to get rid of them, right? And telling Black folks, you have to choose your leaders more wisely. So in the initial one, it was blaming the Black community for their own destruction and for the massacre. White folks they reframed white folks as being like, here's the benevolent white folks afterwards trying to help rebuild their city. And especially like the Tulsa World, for example, said, do not, it is the Black community should not basically reject and the kindness of like the help that's being shown by the white community to rebuild. And so they try to frame like white folks as being trying to rebuild this city. And also that there were questions whether Black people, the mayor was saying that Black folks have to like work to clean up this city. It was saying Black and white, but really Black folks need to work to clean up the city. right after a massacre, right? And if not, they get arrested. And the paper, the Tulsa World, for example, was talking about, yeah, Black folks need to show basically their indebtedness, you know, like their gratitude of like the kindness of this community. I'm paraphrasing it, in trying to rebuild this community by actually working to take the hand that's offered to help them by going to work and rebuild, you know, cleaning up the destruction. And meanwhile, like Black folks, thousands of Black folks were detained in detention camps, and they were not allowed to leave without the permission for, let's say, of a white employer or something like that, the detention camps, right? So it was blaming Black folks for their own massacre of their own communities, and trying to reframe the goodness of the white community in trying to aid the Black community and rebuild the city. So there was both the Tulsa Tribune did it in much more harsher kind of racist language, but the Tulsa Tribune, the Tulsa World, that Tulsa Tribune was like much more direct racist language. Mm-hmm. But the language of the Tulsa World was also racist, and again, the Tulsa World still exists today. And you know, and I don't know, I don't know whether it does. I'm unaware of whether the Tulsa World has ever acknowledged their role. And the last thing I'll say is that afterwards, which is the other question you asked, there was a conspiracy to erase what happened in Tulsa from the collective minds, not only the city but also the nation. Let's say, right? The local newspapers, the institutions would not, after the massacre, you know, would not mention it, would not mention anniversaries, would not report about it. The Tulsa Tribune, which lit the fuse here, it took them 50 years before they even mentioned the massacre. So they were a part of the conspiracy intentionally to not discuss this at all in their coverage, you know? And that's the harm of the story that don't get told. And they were complicit. They were complicit totally, you know, because these newspapers were part of the white power structure in the city, you know? And so they were a part of the cover-up. And there was a lot of powerful people in Tulsa, since thousands of people invaded Tulsa. Mm-hmm. That's your neighbor. Those are your neighbors. Those are your business leaders. You know, you can't. You are going to be very. You're going to tread lightly on the folks who have power to expose them, right? So that's why even 50 years after that, and I'm going to stop here. Is like there was an effort by a white reporter to write a story about Tulsa. And he was being basically threatened not to write it in 1971. And he realized, he said, because a lot of folks who are 60 and 70 years old at the time, some of them may actually have taken part in the massacre, which is still why in 1971 it was still unsafe for this reporter or this writer, let's say, to write about the Tulsa massacre, even in 1971, 50 years later, because there were still people very much alive who probably took part in the massacre. That's why, you know, it speaks to the cover-up, because so many people will be implicated in taking part in the massacre.
Thank you, Joe. And for folks who maybe are just tuning in, I'm Colette Watson here with my colleague and best-selling author. I know he hates when we say that, but it's true. Best-selling author Joe Torres of Free Press and the Media 2070 Project. And Joe, as you're talking about, you know, the cover up of this story and some of the complicity of various media and even people who had participated in the violence through the years, I think one thing that strikes me is that as we just saw testimony recently from the survivors, from a few survivors who are still with us, even 100 years later, that, you know, they talked about reparations and they talked about repair of the harm. But oftentimes when the conversation about reparations comes up, people, some of the rebuttals are that slavery was too long ago, that people in this time did not own slaves and therefore are not responsible for those harms and should not be held financially or materially responsible for contributing to or being a part of reparations. But what's really striking me is that not only would some of the actual assailants and attackers have still been alive in 1971, but their children are people who we are in community with now.
Yeah.
This is not something that was 400 years ago, as people like to say when they talk about slavery. This was 100 years ago. Survivors, people who remember what happened, are still here, and people whose parents participated are still perhaps in Tulsa or elsewhere. The children and grandchildren, the descendants of not only the survivors, but the attackers are still with us. And we are all still living the effects of not only the violence of that day, the loss of all that Black property and wealth and livelihood, but also the trauma and also the continued suppression of the story. And I think that really strikes me, particularly in the ways that we often hear, again, rebuttals of reparations as having been too long ago. What do you think about reparations as it relates to the Tulsa massacre?
Well, to me, it's like there's even debate that maybe the three, I've seen articles and folks talk about maybe the three survivors that currently is like Viola Ford Fletcher, Leslie Benningfield Randall. Viola's 107, Leslie is 106, and Viola's brother Hughes Van Ellis, who's 100. Maybe they're the only ones who should receive reparations. Them, you know. It's like, no, it's like the whole community has impacted. Matter of fact, I believe the current mayor, I believe was a Republican, said the conditions of Black folks today in Tulsa and the inequities that exist is a direct connection to the massacre. If you just think about it, you know, the stuff we've been working on, Colette, with Media 2070, we think about Wilmington, North Carolina, right, where it was a multiracial coalition government, right, and there was a thriving Black community in Wilmington just decades after the Civil War and Reconstruction, right, and all that. And here in 1921, a thriving Black community, right? And here, in both instances, in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was an overthrow of a local government, right? Because it was Black led. It was a fusion government of Black and white folks who were in the Democratic Party at the time, overthrew the local government because of the Black power that was existed in Wilmington. And here, and it shows like, despite like everything that happened, how the Black community was able to build thriving communities that needed to be destroyed, right? That were destroyed. And the idea of like all the policies since then, all the policies that are overt in nature were covert in their results, right? Are like continued to this day. And the idea that what happened in 1921 didn't affect and the cover up of it didn't affect everything of how public policy was developed along the way that resulted in inequities that exist. I read like the Human Rights Watch has a good report on that lay out the inequities that exist today in the Tulsa community and draws the direct line to what happened. And you know, look, we talked about like there was two Black newspapers, the Tulsa Star and Oklahoma Sun, that were destroyed. The Tulsa Star, the publisher was a prominent member in the Black community, right? And whenever in Oklahoma there was racial outbreaks happen, he actually would travel there, report on it, but also seek to help the community. And after the days following the massacre, he was blamed, and others in the Black community were blamed for the massacre, and charges were brought up, and he had to flee. And you know, the lack of like a vibrant Black press, right, or a more vibrant Black press, is also a sign of like all the different indicators that show the health and well-being of a community that has been harmed need to improve. It's like that's why we need not just reparations for the Tulsa community, the Black community in Tulsa, but also all the different institutions that were impacted, right, and including the media, and so you know, because try to restore what the community once was, right, prior to the harm that happened. And so, yeah, it's like if there's ever example of a no-brainer, this should be it. But this is America, right? There's no such thing as no-brainers, especially at a time when there's an effort through this whole nonsense of critical race theory being thrown up as a boogeyman to continue telling our stories. Telling these stories are powerful, right? And there's still an effort to make sure these stories that get told, because when these stories are told, they get acknowledged. Then it's like there's a chance, right? Like that redress has to happen, and that's about power. And so this is why, like, even the reparation should be a no-brainer for Tulsa. It's hard. It's still Viola Fletcher, traveled to DC for the first time in her life to say before Congress during the pandemic at 107 that she said, basically, if I can just read her quote here, so she said, our country may forget this history. I will not. The other survivors do not. Our descendants do not. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented the best, what was possible for the Black people in America and for all people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We in our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us in our history. It's like, this is, anyway, as you can see, I can go on, but let's stop. This is what we do. This is what we do. We prevent our story, we prevent stories from being told, because narrative is powerful. Narrative is anti-Black narrative is used to weaponize, to subjugate the Black community. And if we change the narrative, it can create a Black liberated future. And it's folks who are obviously invested in not seeing that happen.
That's right. Thank you again, Joe. For folks who may not know, we are discussing the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, in which the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was destroyed by white citizens. That area had been dubbed Black Wall Street by Booker T. Washington, and was a flourishing business and residential district, destroyed over 2 days, May 31st and June 1st, in 1921. And we're about to enter into the 100th anniversary of that tragedy. My colleague Joseph Torres has researched media's role, particularly in that massacre and its aftermath and the suppression of the story, and also the brave Black truth tellers who fought to make sure that the truth was known. So as we wrap up our conversation here today, Joe, and I know that you and I could talk all day about it, particularly with regard to our work with the Media 2070 Media Reparations Project. But I do want to mention that, there are truth tellers and journalists and media makers who fought to make sure that this story was known about at great personal peril, in the face of great danger there in Tulsa and in other parts of the country, including the Goodwin family, who came to own the Oklahoma Eagle, which quite literally rose from the ashes of the Tulsa Massacre. So as we wrap up, Joe, can you talk a little bit about the Oklahoma Eagle and just how this notion of Black media ownership and power is exemplified, I guess, through, that particular newspaper as it still exists today, and is what we're fighting for when we talk about media reparations, and how it could have, made this story known before now, and just what it means going forward. I think I just asked you about 4 questions.
No, it's okay. I got it. No, it's like the first person, like Mary, I want to recognize Mary E. Jones Parrish, right? She, a Black woman, an educator, who was a journalist, who lived in Greenwood, fled with her daughter, and within and right after the massacre, she self-published a book that retold her own story about what happened, but also interviewed those of the survivors and recorded it. Like very much in the same way that Ida B. Wells recorded lynching, she recorded what happened in that community and to its citizens, Black citizens. And then the Eagle, the Tulsa Star, as I mentioned, the paper was destroyed. The publisher fled the state. And the publisher for the Oklahoma Sun, the other Black paper that was destroyed, was able to salvage the printing presses of the Tulsa Star, created the Oklahoma Eagle. The Goodwin family, E.L. Goodwin, I believe the grandfather of the current owners, purchased it in 1936. The family has been running it since. The publisher, I believe, today is James Goodwin. And the papers, started in 1960. The papers would celebrate write editorials on anniversaries of the massacre, talking about it. Would name the survivors, like when they write about Black folks in the community, would talk about whether they're survivors of the massacre, so forth and so on. And and Don Ross, who is a legendary figure in Oklahoma, worked at the Tulsa, the Oklahoma Eagle in the 1960s, and he editorialized about it in the 1960s. And he went on to become a state rep. And he's the person who introduced the legislation that created the Tulsa Race Riot Commission that issued his report in 2001 and investigated what happened. So he was basically, his career began out of the Oklahoma Eagles as well. So the lineage of the Oklahoma Eagle in making sure this story is being told, it still continues to this day. So, it shows you the power of the Black press historically, and why we need to continue to ensure, like, as we fight for reparations, that there is an abundance of Black owned and operated platforms and journalists who are continuing to tell the story, and that's part of the reparations fight, because it's severely underfunded, and the policies that have passed have continued to result in excluding some folks from being able to own important media platforms.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, everyone who's tuning in and watching us today. I do want to ask folks to join the conversation here in the comments on Free Press Live, presented by Free Press. And I want to ask, did you know, rather, prior to today, about the Tulsa Massacre? And if so, how did you find out about it? Let us know in the comments as we continue to discuss the role of systemic media oppression and anti-Blackness in suppressing not only this story, but powerful historical truths and realities here in the United States. And in the Media Reparations Project, Joe, we are definitely dedicated to holding accountable not only the media system, but also the federal government, which sets policies that shape the structure of that system and the ways that it excludes Black voices and other communities of color, as well as the ways that historically it has been set up to harm us. So I want to thank you for your work on this project of understanding media's role in the Tulsa Massacre, and overall with Media 2070. If folks want to learn more about media reparations, you can visit media2070.org. You can read lots more about Joe's work there, and I do encourage you to pick up his book along with Juan Gonzalez, News for All the People. Joe, thank you so much for joining me here on Free Press Live today. It's always an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Colette. Appreciate it. Thank you for allowing me to be part of Media 2017. Thank you.
Absolutely. Of course. And folks, I want to let you know that Free Press Live airs every Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern via Facebook and YouTube. You can join us for news and updates from the world of communications rights and learn how you can take action at freepress.net. And remember, Free Press doesn't accept any funding from government or corporations. And you can help our work keep going, including Media 2070, by donating now at freepress.net/donate. So let us know in the comments if you knew about the Tulsa Massacre or what other historical stories you think need to be known more about, and how the media system can be transformed. We look forward to talking to you here in the comments throughout the week. Be sure to share this episode with your friends and colleagues, and we'll see you back here for Free Press Live next Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Thank you again, Joe. Thank you again, everyone watching, and we'll see you next week.